Post-criticism, an apology. Bob Dylan once sang, "Something is happening and you don't know what it is." Well, something's happening in literary criticism and I don't know what it is. It's something called, well, it has many names: post-criticism, critical creative writing, creative critical writing, ficto-criticism, creative reading, the lyric essay, autobiographical criticism, etc. If asked to say what it is, even though I don't know, I would say something like this: that it's an impulse arising from within criticism and from its fundamental strangeness, and that it is an impulse, therefore, to resist the normalities of academic prose. In other words, there is something in the sheer wildness of reading and writing about reading that resists conventional academic patterns, demanding instead a form of criticism that does not look like an essay, but may look more like, say, a dream, or a fragment, or a monologue, or a dialogue. Post-criticism is then a way of thinking about texts that remains very much an act of reading and of quotation, but that is not confined to linear reasoning. Instead, it draws on any and every strategy to be found within literature itself: irony, hyperbole, hesitation, digression, allusion, character, dialogue, etc., etc. In short, post-criticism is a form of literary criticism that seeks to be truly literary, a literary criticism that really is literary criticism. Anyway, something is, I think, happening. Something that means book series with titles like Critical Inventions or Beyond Criticism, and books with titles like Creative Criticism or The Creative Critic, or even Critic: Sighs, Cries, Lies, Insults, Outbursts, Hosts, Disasters, Letters of Resignation, and various other noises off in these, the first and last days of literary criticism. It is almost as if we have finally heeded the terse four-word advice that the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once, in 1929, gave to the literary critic F.R. Leavis upon bumping into him in the street in Cambridge. The advice was this: give up literary criticism. Why? Well, also in 1929, Virginia Woolf writes this: "To write criticism is now like keeping my hand clenched." For Virginia Woolf, criticism, it seems, is like pain, or what we might be tempted to call physical or mental crisis. Tempted because the two words criticism and crisis are, of course, historically related. It is all enough to make one think that criticism might be defined as crisis. If so, it is perhaps best defined by one very particular crisis, a crisis that Matthew Arnold describes way back in 1864, when in The Function of Criticism, he contrasts criticism and creativity. Creative activity, he says, is the promised land toward which criticism can only beckon. That promised land will not be for critics to enter. We shall die in the wilderness. In 1890, however, 25 years later, along comes Oscar Wilde, who responds to Arnold's essay with The Critic as Artist, a dialogue as it happens, and there we read the outrageous declaration that criticism is itself an art. So, Arnold versus Wilde, the critic as failed poet versus the critic as the true artist. And Wilde pushes this further, because you see, while Arnold writes that the primary aim of the critic is to see the object as in itself it really is, Wilde, ever the contrarian, writes that the primary aim of the critic is to see the object as in itself it really is not. So, from Arnold, we have the common sense view that as a critic, my task is to observe, as if a scientist, the object that is the text. And from Wilde, we have the perverse view that as a critic, my task is, well, it's difficult to say. It seems something like to see the text as it is not, which is perhaps to see the text otherwise, to missee it or re-see it, or to see it as it may be or will be or could be, but not as it is. Wilde adds, by the way, that the work of criticism need not bear any obvious resemblance to the thing it criticizes. Strange, we think. We had thought, or just presumed, that criticism should hold a mirror up to the text, that my essay on, say, Hamlet should be a kind of picture of Hamlet, that it would, in some sense, show us what is actually there in Hamlet. After all, that is how we have been taught. Cue George Steiner, again Cambridge, though now it's 1979, when in a brilliant essay called Critic Reader, he remarks that the fundamental postulate of the critical act is one of realism. Steiner goes on to say that scholarly criticism should not collapse the distinction between subject and object, that is to say, the distinction between the critic and the text. So, critic or scholar here, text there. Do not allow the two to vanish into each other. Mind the gap. However, across the Channel, in Paris, also in the 1970s, things are looking a lot less tidy. There, in a book called The Pleasure of the Text, the theorist Roland Barthes is saying that when it comes to literary criticism, there is not a subject and an object. Well, if Barthes is right, we might hop the Atlantic and skip 10 years to 1983 and to an essay called The Object of Post-Criticism, where the American critic Greg Ulmer brilliantly declares that the break with realism, which revolutionized the modernist arts, is now underway, belatedly, in criticism. Criticism, implies Ulmer, has to date been Victorian, that is to say, realist or representational in its relationship to text. But just as modernism smashed the Victorian mirror of realism, think, say, of The Wasteland, so now, at last, criticism is arriving at its very own modernist moment. Ulmer, by the way, is talking about the avant-garde literary cum philosophical thought of his day, above all, deconstruction, think Derrida. Such writing, says Ulmer, is a form of late modernism, or, if you like, it's a critical form of modernism. In other words, it's a form of writing in which the critic or thinker is no longer thought to stand outside the text and to be holding up a mirror to it, but rather is on the inside of the text. To conclude, let me quote the deconstructionist Jeffrey Hartman from his 1980 book, criticism in the wilderness. Here he writes this: literary commentary may yet cross the line and become literature. Well, that's it. I have no more to say, or at least I have no more words of my own to say. I do, though, have just a few from the German Jewish thinker Walter Benjamin, who in 1931 suddenly and quite out of the blue refers to magical criticism. Magical criticism, he says, is a manifestation of the highest stage of criticism. Alas, Benjamin does not say what he means. But then magical criticism, if magical, is perhaps a secret.